Love Gawasar is not and he has gone for media briefing, so I will represent Manish today.
Thank you. The same is happening here. I think Dr. Professor Guleria has had to step out for the same press briefing, and therefore he'll probably join us if the press briefing finishes a little early. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody who has joined us for this second webinar on a series of webinars to improve management of COVID-19 across the country. It's an initiative of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. It's called the Centers of Excellence Program. It's a continuation of a program which they started last year very effectively to spread basics on management of COVID-19, initially with state centers of excellence. And we've now brought on regional centers of excellence to expand this training and spread it a little more quickly. The first session that we had was on Friday, where we had a presentation from AIIMS New Delhi on the management of COVID-19, mild COVID-19 at home. And we talked about non-drug-based therapy, non-medication-based therapy on the management of COVID-19. Our objective today is to start a discussion on drug-based therapies and what are the various medications that are to be used in the management of COVID-19. May I request Dr. Manish Suneja from AIIMS Delhi to please join the conversation if he's here.
Good afternoon, I am here, sir.
Hi, Manish. Is Neeraj also online? Dr. Neeraj Nischal? Okay, I don't know whether Neeraj has been able to join in yet or not. Neeraj was conducting another training session parallel at about 3 o'clock. Manish, maybe you'd like to start with the general outline of the guidelines and what they talk about in terms of drug management for COVID-19 when patients are at home.
Okay, so I'll just check if Neeraj is trying to join. He has a presentation as well. So what we have new in our national protocol in mild patients, in addition to what we were doing previously, is that addition of an NSAID, that is naproxen, has been added in patients who are continuing to have high-grade fever beyond 5 days of illness, beyond 4 to 5 days of illness, having high-grade fever. The basic idea is to have some mechanism of suppressing the immune response. We know now that the viral test typically gets abates by day 5-6, and whatever fever that comes after that period, high-grade fever, is mostly related to the immune response. So that was the idea behind including NSAIDs. So we have something short of a steroid to suppress the immune response. And in addition, what has been added is a nebulized MDI Budecort, MDI or DPI Budecort, that is budesonide inhalations at the maximum dose of 1600 micrograms per day. Again, this has come from the two studies, STOIC trial, wherein benefits has been shown in all groups of patients in terms of reducing the likelihood of progression to severe disease. And more so, the effects were seen more pronounced in people who were later half of the first peak, around the first peak of illness and later than 7 days. That subgroup showed the most gratifying results. So that's why we see in our protocol, in the national protocol that we have, is that use of budesonide in patients who are at home isolation are otherwise mild, but are having some symptoms which are persisting beyond 5 days into day 6-7. So these two are the new additions to our armamentarium, which was not there previously. Strong NSAID and inhaled MDI. So what is also clearly mentioned is that this budesonide should not be given by nebulizer. Now, what nebulizer that we commonly tend to get used in a household setting is a ultrasonic nebulizer. Now, it is well known that this budesonide doesn't get really well suspended by that mechanism. So, what a jet nebulizer is required, what we use in a hospital setting, or a mesh nebulizer, which obviously is not so routinely available. So that's why MDI with a spacer or a DPI, dry powdered inhalation of budesonide, is preferred, and not a nebulization is not mentioned. There were some questions on it, so that's why just clarifying on that point. And beyond that, obviously, ivermectin is there, which was not there in the first wave. Ivermectin component has been added as a, which may be considered in all patients as an antiviral activity. Now, obviously, the evidence is not very strong, but what we do have is from, it is being widely given, and it is based on the theoretical plausibility, which is supported by in vitro data and physiologic-based pharmacokinetic modeling studies. The available clinical studies, which are predominantly RCTs, have demonstrated reduced mortality and the decreased need for requiring mechanical ventilation. However, we must be very clear that the strength of evidence is low given the high risk of bias in these studies, along with serious imprecision. It was mainly due to low information size. Now, what we have now is that ivermectin may be considered, particularly in patients who are symptomatic in the viral phase of the disease during the first 5-6 days of illness, particularly among those who have risk factors for high-risk disease. So these are the new SCQs continues in our national protocol. In addition, what has been added here is low-dose oral steroids, which has been reserved for a group of patients who continue to have symptoms despite the use of a good dose of anti-inflammatory drugs, that is NSAIDs, around day 5 to 7 of illness, along with MDI, budecort, budesonide. Those group of patients who continue to have a high-grade fever, cough. So these are the high-risk groups who may eventually land up in hospital with moderate COVID when they desaturate. Obviously, that will take some time, 3-4 days. So they give us this window of opportunity of 3 to 4 days, wherein we can suppress the immune response and prevent the progression to moderate disease, thereby freeing up the valuable hospital resources, the hospital beds and oxygen requirement. Now this has been time thinking about the fact that most of the studies that have shown the virus usually becomes non-replicable by day 8 of illness, day 8, 9, the virus is mostly non-replicable, though the RT-PCR may continue to be positive for many weeks. So this was the idea behind corticosteroids that is given in the national protocol. That is, once the viral replication has stopped and the immune phase has started, and the immune phase may go unchecked, and then the patient will land up with pneumonia and with desaturation and oxygen requirement. To preempt that phase, I think this has been added, but always with a very with a caveat that it has to be in consultation with the local treating physician, and steroid, if it is used, it has to be used in a low dose form for a very short duration, 3 to 5 days. So this is in brief what were new additions to the medication part of management in mild illness.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you for summarizing the changes that have taken place in the modified guidelines. I can see Naveen is all, Neeraj is also online. Dr. Neeraj Nischal is an associate professor of medicine at AIIMS New Delhi, and one of the people, along with Manish, who've been actively involved in managing a large number of these patients and contributing to these guidelines. Neeraj was conducting another VC immediately prior to this, doing something very similar to what's being done here for physicians in Bihar. So thank you, Neeraj, for finishing that and joining here. And I'm going to hand over to Neeraj now to make a presentation on drug management of mild COVID at home. So it's over to you, Neeraj.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Dr. Manish, for basically taking more burden out of me, because you have very explained the basis of the changes which has happened in our home isolation guideline. And of course, everybody knows about the drug which can be used in this particular disease, but it's the timing of the use of drug that it actually decides what will be the outcome of the patient. So right drug at right time can actually save life. And we all have seen that it's progression of mild to moderate. That is the time when we can actually intervene and save life. So it's very crucial when to intervene. We should be very well aware of that. And considering that most of the patient, in around 80 to 85% of patients can be managed at home, that's why this aspect needs very, I will say, importance, because if we can manage these patients at home, the hospital burden will decrease. And if we can identify which all patients will require our care in hospital so that they can be transferred to hospital for appropriate treatment will save life. So in today's presentation, of course, what was done on during last program, which I guess was on Friday, there will be some overlap, but for continuity, it's important that we go through that particular aspect as well. So we all know the common symptoms of COVID-19, and that has to be re-emphasized again and again at community level, so that if somebody has any of these symptoms, that particular person should isolate and get themselves tested so as to stop the spread of this virus in the community. And especially those people who we all know 80% of cases are asymptomatic and are detected as a case of consequence of contact tracing or screening for other reasons. Among symptomatic cases, all the symptoms may not be present, and it could be a combination of various symptoms which have been described for this COVID-19, which in fact is similar to other viral illnesses. But since COVID-19 is basically upsurge of cases we are seeing, so most of these symptoms, if anyone has any of these symptoms, should be a suspect case of COVID-19 and requires testing. So whenever we suspect a COVID-19 patient or contact, you should test for SARS-CoV-2. If negative, observe and retest if symptoms persist or if patient develop new symptoms like shortness of breath and other aspects. If positive, we have to classify whether it's moderate or severe requiring hospital admission or mild. And with mild cases should be asked for home isolation, and they should be warned about the possible deteriorating signs, which include difficulty in breathing, dip in oxygen saturation, persistent pain or pressure in the chest, mental confusion or inability to arouse, especially in elderly patients. All these are warning signs, and this should be emphasized to the patients going in home isolation. So what if I am positive? What all aspects should be taken into account? Of course, the most important aspect is to prepare oneself for all eventualities. So it's important that you get your contacts ready, whether it's health information and care regarding your doctor, health facilities which you might have to visit in case if your symptoms worsen. And of course, hotline numbers and emergency numbers distributed by local administration should also be kept handy. Apart from that, you should have your own support network of family, friends, and neighbors who are going to help you out with the daily needs item and other aspects. Stock up on supplies such as regular medicine, whatever medicines you have been taking, if you have some comorbidities, medical masks, cleaners and disinfectant, because these all items will be required for during your stay for 10 to 14 days in home isolation. Prepare a separate room or isolated space and keep distance from others. It's important that the person who is infected should be isolated from other non-infected members of the family. Put in place a support network for groceries, transport, child care, especially those families who have a child. They should be taken care of in a way that they are not neglected and they are taken care of. Another regular essential, you have to plan what all and from where are you going to get all those essentials from. Get in touch with a doctor once you are COVID positive. Home isolation may be provided for those who have clinically assigned as mild or asymptomatic cases. The requisite facility at their residence for self-isolation is there, and also for quarantining family contacts, that is also there. Have a caregiver who may be able to provide care on 24/7 basis with regular communication link with the hospital or a doctor with whom he or she may contact regarding the well-being of the patient. For home isolation, after proper evaluation by the treating medical officer, elderly more than 60 years, hypertensive, diabetic, patient with heart disease, patient with chronic lung, liver or kidney disease, cerebrovascular disease, this should be evaluated by a medical officer, and then whether they are fit for home isolation or not, a decision should be taken. The same goes with those with immunocompromised status, whether they are HIV patient, transplant recipients, or are on cancer therapy. All these patients should be in touch with the medical officer so that decision regarding home isolation can be taken. It's important that the room of the patient, wherever possible, should be well ventilated, and if possible, keep the windows open or at least open them frequently. But if you are living in a crowded neighborhood where window of one person is opening into windows of other, those all aspects have also been taken into account before opening window. But wherever possible, please ensure that the natural ventilation is taken care of in that particular isolated room. Identify one household member to be the contact person who is not at high risk and has the fewest contacts with people outside. So this person should not be going outside the house, should have less amount of risk factors as compared to other members of the family. Only this person should be interacting with the infected person. Wear a medical mask or preferably a N95 mask in the same room as the sick person. Use separate dishes, preferably if possible disposable dishes, cups, eating utensils, and beddings from the sick person. Clean and disinfect frequently touched surfaces, including whether it's doorknob or the toilet, if you have common toilet or something of that sort. Of course, all these things should be frequently disinfected. Monitor the sick person's symptoms regularly. Pay special attention if the person is at high risk of any serious illness, especially elderly with comorbidities. Ensure the sick person rests and stays hydrated. Frequent hand washing. One should follow cuff etiquettes. Do not share personal items. And of course, all frequently touched surfaces like tabletops, doorknobs, handles should be cleaned with bleach or 1% hypochlorite solution. Use at least a triple layer mask at all times. Discard mask after 8 hours of use or earlier if wet or visibly soiled. Both caregiver and patient should wear masks, preferably N95 mask when in the same room. Masks should be discarded in paper bags only after disinfecting it with 1% sodium hypochlorite solution. Perform hand hygiene after discarding these masks or any of the items which the infected person have used. Now, one of the most panicky situation is saturation of the patient. So proper use of pulse oximeter is the most important thing. So the most important reason for this type of problem is non-proper use of pulse oximeter. So always test using one reliable finger pulse oximeter by applying to usually one particular finger only. You should not be changing pulse oximeter frequently or using different fingers at different times. Other important points to be noted is to remove any nail polish or false nails and warm your hand if cold. If hands are cold, saturation may be falsely low. Make sure you have some resting before it for at least 5 minutes before taking your measurement. This is again very important. Rest your hand on your chest at heart level and hold still. Switch the pulse oximeter on and place it on your finger. The reading takes time to steady, so keep the pulse oximeter in place for at least a minute or longer if the reading keeps changing. Record the highest result once the reading has not changed for 5 seconds. So it's always a range which will come. So the usual range will be somewhere between 94 to 99. And once if the range starts shifting towards the lower side, say now the range has become 90 to 94, then that is the time when you can safely say you are desaturating and you require intervention. A monitoring chart should be prepared and daily monitoring of pulse, oxygen level, temperature, what are the symptoms are getting better or worse, what is the breathing pattern, that all things should be charted, and this should be shared with your doctor in whom you are in touch with. So it's important that whatever treatment you take, it has to be in consultation with the doctor. So stay in communication with the treating physician and promptly report any deterioration. Continue medication for your comorbid condition after consulting with the physician. You should not be stopping your prior medication without confirming with the doctor. Should be doing saline gargles at least twice a day. Whenever possible, do steam inhalation at least twice a day. These all are for symptomatic treatment. These misconception that this is going to kill virus, that is not the right idea. The right idea for all these maneuver is to ensure that whatever symptomatic relief you can get, you can utilize all these methods. For fever, normally paracetamol is given and can be given up to 4 to 6 times a day, depending on the requirement. If fever persists after consulting with physician, you can try other NSAIDs like naproxen, which can be given 250 milligram BD, can also be increased to 500 milligram BD in appropriate situation. Other symptomatic treatment like use of tablet cetirizine or levocetirizine for cough and cold can be used. Cough syrup like antitussives can also be prescribed depending on the requirement. The other treatment given for mild COVID in home isolation include have ivermectin, which most of us are using these days, and can be prescribed for 3 to 5 days to be taken empty stomach once a day. Inhalational budesonide can be prescribed if fever and cough persist beyond 5 days, and the usual dose is 800 microgram twice a day for 5 to 7 days, depending on the situation of the patient and what type of progression the patient has as far as disease is concerned. We have discussed about oral steroids. Oral steroids not indicated in mild disease, but in case the fever persists, there is worsening of cough beyond 7 days, then one should consult a physician for starting low dose oral steroid. It has to be remembered that steroids are not treatment for SARS-CoV-2. Oral steroids, in fact, if taken too early, can actually help this virus to replicate and survive for more than what we anticipate. So steroids can be used only if the fever persists beyond 7 days or there is worsening of cough, and that too in consultation with physician. Remdesivir should never be used or administered at home, and it's not required in patient with mild COVID. You have to seek medical advice, especially when there is difficulty in breathing, there is dip in saturation, which is less than 94%. Persistently, there is persistent pain or pressure in the chest, there is mental confusion or inability to arouse, or any other symptom which was not there and can be debilitating for the patient. So these are the aspects when we have to immediately seek medical advice for hospital admission from your treating doctors. The various steroids that can be used include dexamethasone, methylpred, or prednisone and prednisolone. So depending on the, you can very well see that the most potent anti-inflammatory effect is that of dexamethasone, and its duration of action is also long. So depending on that, the initial dosing may be 6 milligram per day. And methylpred is approximately 5 times more requirement. So equivalent of dose of that will be around 30 or 32 milligram methylpred per day. Similarly, prednisone and prednisolone in 40 milligram in divided doses. So depending on which type of steroid you are using, you have to dose accordingly. End home isolation after at least 10 days have passed from onset of symptoms or date of sampling for patients who were asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic cases, and should be afebrile for at least 3 days. There is no need for testing after home isolation period is over, and that should be emphasized to the patients. Other measures include the hygiene, which is again cleanliness is next to godliness. We all know, and for this particular pandemic, it is very important. You should know your risk to lower your risk. If you have comorbidities and other things, definitely you should be taking more care. Once you develop symptom, isolate yourself so that others in the family members can remain safe. And you have to seek medical help. Do not believe in social media forwards regarding treatment options, and you have to take medical advice before taking any treatment option. Stay positive, indulge in your daily routine physical activity wherever possible. And infodemic, again, this misinformation about COVID-19 on social media platform is very rampant. So you have to gather information from official reliable sources like WHO, ICMR, and other institution of repute like AIIMS and other institutes. So to summarize, do not panic if COVID positive, be positive in spirit. Home care is advisable in most of the patients, especially asymptomatic and mild COVID patients. Keep essential over-the-counter medicine, but do not hold medical supplies. That's again important. Breaking the chain, so you have to isolate yourself, wear mask, ensure your hand washing is appropriate, and wherever possible, vaccinate your family members. Create self-help group to tide over this isolation times, and of course, be aware of infodemic. You cannot be ignorant anymore, and whatever treatment option you have to take in conjunction with the advice of your doctor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neeraj. That was an excellent summary of what needs to be done in home isolation in terms of medication. Before we go on to the questions that we have received on the Q&A and the chat box, I'd like to invite the panelists on the panel if they'd like to raise any comments or give their suggestions. Everybody who's on the panel is welcome to either raise their hands or just unmute themselves and give their comments.
Do we have enough evidence for favipiravir or ivermectin? Ivermectin, it is being suggested in the presentation, but I doubt that it is really evidence-based.
Okay, Neeraj, Manish, we took this up on Friday as well. I remember, Manish, we had this discussion on Friday as well. Maybe one of you would like to summarize it again. Neeraj, would you like to say, maybe Manish would. Manish is aware of the answer we had on Friday. So Manish, maybe you'd like to summarize.
Okay, the thing is, yes, we are on a soft pitch here because ivermectin as such, we obviously do not have anything very conclusive as of now with any high degree of certainty of evidence, high grade evidence. But what we do have is a theoretical ivermectin being useful. Now, if you look at the Australian study, they suggested that serum concentration is required 30 times of what we usually get with our dosing in clinical practice. 30 times the dosage is required to inhibit the virus completely, IC50 values. If you look at the pharmacokinetic studies, physiologic-based pharmacokinetic modeling studies, the ivermectin has 10 times more penetration, concentration in the lungs compared to the serum. So it is there that ivermectin does get concentrated in the lungs. So that is the theoretical part of it. If you look at the practical aspect of it, there are clinical studies and mostly RCTs have been done, mostly in Asia, which have reduced mortality, which shows that there is reduced mortality and decreased need for mechanical ventilation. Now, obviously, the strength of evidence is questioned and is labeled as low certainty of evidence because of the high risk of bias in the studies. And all of the studies have a very wide confidence interval due to the imprecision, due to the low sample size. So, taking in all the limitations that we have of the available studies, you can just check up also there are living systematic reviews even in WHO site and other places, which is including all the studies that they are being conducted and being included. Now what the summary is that the strength of evidence is low, but ivermectin probably has some protective effect in preventing progression to severe disease. So, and in the given circumstances that we do not have any other drug which has proven to be effective, favipiravir even doesn't have that level of evidence what ivermectin has. I would put ivermectin in terms of available evidence higher than favipiravir, and favipiravir has its own side effects, the pill burden, the GI side effects, the hyperuricemia and all other things there. Safety issue with ivermectin is not at all an issue. We know we have used even 10 times the normal dose that has been used 1 to 1 a day. That has been shown to be pretty safe in human beings. Not an issue. There are initial signals that yes, it may be beneficial, and we are buying just whatever beneficial it may be, whatever little percentage benefit that we may get, in absence of any proven therapy that we have. So
another small point which was missed in the discussion was many physicians, they advise awake proning, self proning in these patients. Again, the outcome is not consistent and not long lasting. It probably provides only transient improvement in the saturation. So it is not included, though it is a debatable point. So what is your take? Generally, I don't believe that it is working. This is my personal opinion.
So let me just clarify another point here. One, while Manish and Neeraj are speaking from the institute, this is more a panel, and therefore it's not exactly these two who are required to address all the queries. If there are others on the panel who wish they would like to participate and address the queries, please do so. So we would like to generate a discussion among everybody who's on the panel, because everybody clearly has experience, and your experience, sir, obviously contributes significantly to what everybody else would be doing.
Yeah, the reason being my comment that it will not help that still in the early stages lungs are compliant. It is not the atelectasis or it is not the phenotype H type. So ideally it should not work, which works in the ARDS protocol, the severe ARDS and mechanically ventilated patients. So in a compliant lung, there should hardly be any benefit. Logically, it doesn't look like providing any benefit, and nor does the literature suggest. But then literature and even many government agencies, they are also promoting that while you are at home, do some awake proning that is going to help. So just wanted to know the opinion of other experts.
So does anybody believe that we should not be recommending awake proning, or does it actually, does it cause harm, or could it potentially be preparing a patient for a situation that if he becomes worse and gets admitted, at least he has some experience of what needs to be done before he gets into the hospital? I took a round in the COVID ward today morning. This was my first actual in PP ward in the round in the COVID. And again, let me clarify, I'm a surgeon. I'm not a pulmonologist. But I saw a lot of patients who were happy to follow the advice on proning. They feel that they were participating in their own care. And I actually saw some saturations improve. Now it's anecdotal evidence, but I felt it was something that they were happy doing. The issue about ivermectin again was something which was discussed last Friday as well. And I think everybody on the guidelines panel, as well as everybody on the panel, agreed that the evidence for it is not something which is very robust. But then the fact is that the evidence is robust against very few things, is in favor of very few things. And therefore, unless there is very strong evidence against it and there is no evidence of harm, that's why it probably was on the guidelines, and that's what was discussed last Friday. But your argument is absolutely correct, sir, that the evidence for it is not very strong. I saw a hand raised somewhere, Dr. Colonel Marwa.
A wonderful talk, sir. Thank you. I had a comment regarding the timing of use of budesonide. So I think the biggest trial which has been done with budesonide is the STOIC trial, where they had used budesonide early in the course of disease, and they found that the patients did not progress from mild to moderate disease. So to my understanding, if it has to be used, it is an inhaled corticosteroid. There's not much problem with viremia because the systemic absorption is not much. So should it be used early in the course of disease to prevent progression to moderate disease, or it should be reserved only for management of cough later in the course?
So does anybody want to take this up? Neeraj, do you want to unmute yourself? Yeah. Can somebody unmute his mic? I don't know whether he's able to do it himself. Yeah.
So again, definitely it's a promising thing that starts steroid right at the start. But after much deliberation before putting it in this thing, what we realized that starting steroid, even if the absorption is too less, it can still cause the problem as far as the immune suppression and other aspects, especially in the early part of disease is concerned, because most of the time this virus will be cleared by our immune system. So once the inflammatory response is going out of control, that is the time when one should start using steroids. And that's the reason when the fever persists beyond 4 and 5 days, then we have a suspicion that, okay, inflammatory response may be going out of control. And the first inflammatory response that needs to be controlled is at the local site, where this inhaled budesonide may be of role. And once if it is not controlled by that, then the role of systemic steroids come into being. So the panel felt that giving steroid, even if it is inhaled, in the early part of disease may actually not help, especially when there is no cough or any respiratory tract symptoms. So that's what was our take, and Dr. Manish would like to add on that.
So I'll just like to add what Neeraj said. So we look at the STOIC and the principal trial. Yes, you rightly said the largest trial. But if we look at the subgroup analysis of it, the most of the benefit was in the patients who were started late. It was throughout, benefit was seen throughout in all patients, but the odds ratio were higher among those who were started 7 days and later. So probably, yes, we know use of steroid. Now 70 to 75% of patients could have their symptoms remit by day 5 of illness. So really need not do anything there. The basic idea, I don't know whether steroids are acting as an antiviral, don't think so. It would be acting as an immune modulator. Now immune phase, which starts after day 5, 6, 7. So probably that is the right time to wait. But this obviously is something theoretical. We do not have evidence, trial-based evidence to talk about it. But probably we walk a thin line of evidence as well as theoretical benefit that may be there. So initially used, it may just, we know using budesonide may increase the risk of infections in the throat, and the viral replication may get triggered. We don't know about that for sure. But yes, that is a prudent approach, I think.
Dr. Bhatia, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, this inhalational steroids will help in some subjective relief if there is severe sore throat and cough because of its anti-inflammatory local action. It will provide some benefit, but it cannot prevent the progression of the disease, and probably immune suppression should not be that much. So I probably would advise only if there is irritating cough, sore throat, severe troublesome sore throat, then yes, it can be given probably.
Right. Thank you for your inputs. Anybody else on the panel would like to bring something up before I take questions from the chat box?
This is Dr. Satyajit Mishra from AIIMS Bhubaneswar.
Right. sir.
Regarding Dr. Bhatia's question on whether awake proning really helps. I mean, if you look at the basis for proning, it is to improve the ventilation to the dorsal segments of the lung, which otherwise don't get ventilated when a patient is lying supine. Now, when the patient is prone, the ventilation is improved to the dorsal segments, and the perfusion still has a preference for the dorsal segments. So the whole idea is to improve the VQ matching. And when we are dealing with saturations, which is borderline around 94 or so, so it's definitely a good step. There may not be any great, evidence in favor of awake proning in the sense that there are no hardcore trials designed for this. But I think that as a measure that a patient can do on his own, and the fact that there is no harm to this, I don't think there's no reason why we should not promote this. Because the whole idea is to improve the VQ matching, and the prone position does that. Regarding the other part, the compliance and the other things, that plays a greater role probably when you're ventilating these patients, because in the early stage of the disease, we say that it's a compliant lung, so you can just go ahead and ventilate with a regular mechanical ventilation. So that plays a role when you're ventilating these patients. But proning, I think, as a measure to improve a VQ matching is just fine, and if the patient can do it, I don't think it should be a problem.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Bhatia. Maybe just one last comment on this.
Yeah,
before we move on to some.
problem is,
don't want to make
it is not contraindicated. The problem is not there, but the effect is transient. That the literature says the effect is very transient, and it does not last long. First of all, secondly, the VQ mismatch problem is when there is H phenotype, not the L phenotype early stages when the lungs are compliant. That is my only take. And when the lungs become heavy, non-compliant, of course it will work.
Perfect. I think we'll stop this proning issue at the moment. I think one thing all of us have accepted it. We've only had a year's experience in managing COVID, and expecting evidence of the kind we look for, even when we give something like statins where 30 years, we don't know whether the evidence is for or against it. So assuming that you're going to get strong evidence in favor of something in a year's management, maybe expecting a bit too much. To a large extent, what we're hoping for is we have evidence it doesn't harm. We have evidence that theoretically it benefits. We have some evidence that it may benefit, so let's try it. I think that's what most of us are working on in the management of COVID. We're not really looking for level 1 evidence for everything. It's very difficult to get it in a year's management. But everybody has very valid points. That's the whole idea of this platform. Let's discuss what are pros and what are cons, and then use judiciously what we think we should use. I'm going to move on to some of the questions on the chat box, because we'd like to address them as well, as many as we can. So the home isolation duration has been decreased from 14 to 10 days. Why was this done? Are we okay with 10 days? It's in the guidelines, so we obviously are okay with it. But would somebody like to address why we dropped it from 14 to 10?
Okay.
It's okay. So everybody agrees with that 10 day, and they're okay with the guidelines. And that's what the CDC has had on their website for a very long time. So I think it's just falling in line with everybody else. All right. Then the next question is on use of piroxicam. What would the panel believe on the use of piroxicam?
So again, any NSAID can be used. So whether it has some mortality benefit or something, we are not sure, but definitely it helps in controlling fever and subjective well-being of the patient. But will that translate into overall benefit to the patient as far as disease outcome is concerned? We are not still sure. So we don't prescribe it regularly, but it can be tried in few of the patients on whom fever is the major complaint, especially in the initial part of disease when we are not considering steroids. Dr. Manish?
Thank you. So the next question is, what cough medicine do you normally recommend? What antitussive would you normally recommend?
So somehow the peripherally acting agent levodopa has been found to be having good control of symptoms in these patients. So that is what we are prescribing. Probably most of our colleagues, every one of us are using more often at present.
Right, thank you. So the next question is, what would you advise a person whose only complaint is pain or pressure in the chest? Saturations are probably okay. Early stage disease in home isolation, and says pain or pressure in the chest. Anybody on the panel can take it. I mean, it's open to everybody on the panel, with or without videos, anybody can take it.
Probably it was reflecting the increased work of breathing. Though the situation may be normal at this point of time, but this heaviness and pain might reflect the this increased work of breathing. And secondly, maybe some have to look into myocardial injury if it is associated with maybe ischemic and something like that. So normally, patients should be properly observed, monitored. It should not be ignored. The symptoms should not be ignored, I guess.
So this person should require a reconsultation with his physician if he is in home isolation and shouldn't be ignoring it and trying to manage it himself.
Yes, sir. It could just be the first sign of undergoing inflammation of the involvement of lung parenchyma. So this should not be ignored at all. And most of the patients also sometimes start complaining of cough as well. So these patients should be actually monitored more closely, because we are seeing such patients, especially those who are in home isolation, in touch with us. They are complaining and they have chances of actually progressing further. So we have to be careful. And also sometimes it's just the reflux. That's why use of PPI should also be utilized in such patients, because they are taking too many NSAIDs, whether it's simply paracetamol or all, that reflux can also cause similar type of effect.
All right. So the next question is on FabiFlu. For how many days should we take it if we are taking it? So I don't see too many people here prescribing FabiFlu. It's not on the guidelines, and therefore, does anybody want to give an answer? If you're taking yes, sir, Dr. Joshi.
Yeah, FabiFlu has been included in the guidelines of Government of Maharashtra, and they have recommended the dose of 1800 twice a day on the first day, followed by 800 milligrams twice a day for another 6 days. The recommendations are for 7 days, and then which can be continued to 14 days as well. So this has been included on the basis of a study by Glenmark, consisting of only 150 patients, where they showed that viral clearance and some symptomatic improvement was better. The evidence is definitely very poor, but still in Maharashtra, practically everyone uses favipiravir routinely, and they have not included ivermectin in their guidelines of Government of Maharashtra task force. In Government of Maharashtra guidelines. So there is some confusion. So many of us use both. If a person is symptomatic in the first week, I use favipiravir as well as ivermectin, because I'm not sure which one will work. And if the patient has no contraindication, I don't think there is any harm in using both of them, because a good antiviral drug to be used in early stages.
Okay, thank you. So that's the next question we have, again on continuing on the theme of medication, is the role of doxycycline and azithromycin. So again, both are very commonly used. Does anybody want to share when they recommend it, when they don't recommend it?
I think they are not recommended in the guidelines as well, and we need to use, we should not be routinely using azithromycin or doxycycline because it's a viral disease. That should be known. But then it has gone into the patients start demanding these kind of things. Azithromycin, they want some antibiotics. This is coming from the patients now. The problem is there was a very good article which showed that in fact azithromycin in the first week in COVID did more harm than good. So we should not be using these antibiotics as a routine, unless and of course where you're suspecting an additional super infection, which is very, very rare.
Right, thank you. Now the next question, continuing on medications, is the use of rivaroxaban in diabetics. Any experience? Anybody wants to address that?
So routine use of anticoagulants, especially in home isolation, unless clearly indicated for some other reason, should not be prescribed. Most of people do prescribe this, but I think it can cause more harm. A lot of people complain of epistaxis and hemoptysis once we start these medication. So those who are in home isolation, who are asymptomatic, mildly symptomatic, just because they have comorbidities does not mean they will require anticoagulant. So I think that should not be practiced, and of course it's open for discussion.
I like to answer this. Majority of people who have been discharged from the hospital and whose D-dimer levels are high, and those who are at high risk of developing cardiovascular events are usually prescribed this rivaroxaban for a period of 3 weeks after their discharge. So this is the routine practice being done in the part in Nagpur and around. In Maharashtra, I can say that. So at home isolation, rivaroxaban is not, which is usually in home isolation, which is usually in the first week, or say in patients who have mild symptoms or asymptomatic patient, absolutely no role of rivaroxaban.
Thank you for that clarification. Now the next question, yeah, you wanted to say something, Dr. Colonel Marwa?
Yes. So the Anti-Thrombosis Society has recommended, and that's what we are also following, that if the patient has had a severe disease, has required NIV or ventilation, so there is a graded ambulation at home. So these patients, it is recommended to give anticoagulation for 4 weeks post-discharge, because it's a prothrombotic disease, and many a time we are seeing pulmonary embolism post-discharge as well. So for mild to moderate disease, it is not recommended. Severe disease, where the patient's return to ambulation is going to take some time, they have comorbidities, and there's a high risk of pulmonary embolism and sudden death at home, it is recommended that one should give this when the patient is being discharged from hospital.
Thank you. So we'll move on to the next one here. And this is again coming back to ivermectin. When should you be starting it if you are starting it?
So again, if we are trying to use its antiviral property, so once somebody is proven as COVID-19, it should be started as early as possible. So timing should be as early as possible. Sometimes people do start when the chances of him being COVID-19 is very high. Then one can start without waiting for report of RT-PCR. But yeah, at least when RT-PCR report is there, we should start preferably within 2-3 days of symptom onset, because that is when it is expected to work.
Okay. Now the next question is somebody who says, I had a very low CT value when my COVID was diagnosed. This is the RT-PCR CT value was very low when it was diagnosed, but symptoms are absent for 4 days, and it's been over 10 days since the positivity. So by the guidelines of home isolation, I have finished that 10 days. I've been 4 days of asymptomatic, but my initial CT value was very low. Does that impact when home isolation should end? Or does the CT value have no impact on the home isolation guidelines?
I think it's very clear. I think the cycle threshold value indicates infectivity rather than severity of the disease. So if you have a low CT value, it probably indicates that you are more infective as compared to people with more CT values. But definitely it has not been correlated with the severity of the disease. And one should not give too much importance to CT values when they see. And I would suggest that even the microbiologists may not write the CT values, because that's very confusing and the patients are misguided and they give a lot of importance to this CT value. And there have been a lot of information on the WhatsApp group where they have come across that CT values, lower the CT values, more severe the disease. It's not true. That it indicates infectivity, but not necessarily correlated with the severity of the disease.
And different RT-PCR kits will have different CT values for the same patient.
Right.
It also changes over days. So you have done a test on one particular day, the infectivity may be different a couple of days later. So that is why one value doesn't hold good.
Absolutely. And also the day in which the swab has been taken, if it is it also depends on the sampling technique also. That might vary, and that would also make an impact on the CT value. So I think it's not important. It's not to be given too much of importance by the patients.
Yeah, a lot of influential people have actually given too much importance to this CT value, and this message should be sent to the society that CT value has got no significance whatsoever except for diagnosis. So we should not be running after CT value, because most of the time patient call us in panic. Mera CT value to 12 hai, main kya karu? So this should be loud and clear that CT value has no significance except for diagnosing a patient.
I think there's also a bit of a need to clarify the difference between CT value and CT score, which unfortunately again creates a lot of confusion among the lay public. And on the other, I mean, getting a CT score of 20 and somebody tells them that they're severe versus getting a CT value of 20 and somebody tells them that they're severe. obviously mean two different things. And this may be a part of the clarification that would go out from these webinars on the difference between CT score and a CT value. The next question that we have here is that what is worse? So somebody who's continuing to have fever on day 9 versus somebody whose fever comes back after being afebrile for a period of time? Or does it not make a difference, or is the management likely to be different in home isolation again?
So if the fever
Somebody who
comes back,
continues to be febrile till 9 days versus somebody who was afebrile for an intervening period and then gets fever back on the 9th day.
At the most, one can go for investigation to check if there is any superadd bacterial infection. So if there is no leukocytosis, or if there are no signs of active infection, bacterial infection, then need not worry about that.
Dr. Marwa?
so if the fever goes away and then comes back, it is an early sign of cytokine storm. So it's a very sinister sign. So we have seen that patients who improve and then again become febrile, so probably they're heralding towards that stage of cytokine storm and going into ARDS. So that should not be taken lightly. So that is why probably the guidelines have recommended low dose steroids, because if you start low dose steroids early in the course when patient has got a fever, and if you do the CRP levels in these patients, you find that the quantitative CRP is very high. And after a day or two, you'll see that they'll certainly fall off the cliff and they are into respiratory failure. So a fever coming back is a sinister sign. And many times we see that these patients have got bradycardia also, which itself is a sign of cytokine storm because of the cytokine induced myocardial suppression.
So this would be a warning sign for which the patient should be recommended that he should contact his physician again, particularly if it comes back after having gone away for a few days.
And we are not seeing much of bacterial infection. In fact, we've hardly seen any procal come back positive, because most of the healthcare workers are using PPE, everybody's wearing a mask. So the incidence of bacterial infection, in fact, in a number of studies, they have shown that the bacterial infection incidence is very, very low. So if in such a circumstance, we are getting a second spike of fever, it is sinister.
Okay.
So
Now,
just regarding fever,
go ahead.
I just wanted to add, fever in COVID-19 is very, I will say, still an enigma. Sometimes we see that a patient presenting with 3 days of fever and chest is very bad. And patient says, okay, I just had 3 days fever. So fever has to be analyzed in a proper way. A proper history is very important. Sometimes what happens, the fever which the patient has presented with is actually the second week of disease, when initial part he might not have any symptoms. And now when he's landing up with cytokine storm, he has started developing fever. So this history has to be very clear. There are two aspects of fever. One, fever can persist for 9 to 10 days. Again, that is not a good thing. And of course, it will require steroid. And then again, when fever recurs, there are two types of fever. One, low-grade fever, 99 point something, less than 100, can persist for 2-3 days. And if we watchfully see that, especially in young people, then it will not cause much of difference. But yes, if the second fever is high grade over 100, 101, then that is something we have to be very careful. And these patients will definitely require steroids. So history of fever, how it has appeared is very important. And when patient first present with fever, one has to rule out that this is the initial symptom only, and we are not missing something which has happened and that was ignored by the patient.
Right. Thanks, Neeraj. So the next question I have here is, the patient is afebrile but has got blood samples done which say elevated D-dimers and CRP. Should we start anticoagulation? Home isolation, otherwise no significant symptoms. Only the D-dimers are elevated significantly and the CRP is also high.
So D-dimer is very non-specific. In many patients, we are seeing that D-dimer are elevated without any obvious reason. And unless it's in thousands, I don't think we should be paying much attention to that, especially in early part of disease, without comorbidities, without patient desaturating. This should be seen in parlance to the clinical picture of the patient. If patient is completely asymptomatic, no fever, no cough, then even if D-dimer is high, we should be, most of the time, if somebody is dehydrated, even in those samples, D-dimer may be high. So we have to see the clinical picture of the patient before deciding anticoagulation. Just because D-dimer is slightly raised, one should not be starting anticoagulants.
Right. Now, the next question here is somebody who's again in home isolation on regular supine position, the saturation is dropping below 90, but on proning comes back up to above 93, 94. Does this patient need to shift to the hospital or not? I can see one nod and one shake, so obviously we can have a discussion on this.
T-time,
Yes, sir, carry on, please.
yeah. So if the saturation is coming back or going down after the patient becomes supine, that means only a transient rise in saturation that's happening when the patient is supining or when he's proning himself. So at this point of time, as long as it's over 90%, it should not really matter. He can continue to stay at home, especially if he has some oxygen therapy at home. He can continue to do so, use the oxygen therapy. Otherwise, he does his regular proning every 2 hourly cycles of lateral, prone, lateral, and sit up. So with this, he can continue till his sats are less than 90%. But having said this, the patients should stay in their bed for long periods at home. A lot of times we see that patients deteriorate once they move out of bed, go for a bath, or use the toilet. So one thing has to be told at home, that they have to be strictly at bed rest, and everything, all their needs have to be catered at the bedside. So as long as you do that and SATs are above 90%, I think you can continue to stay at home. In the meantime, look for a hospital and have something up your sleeve.
I would agree, sir. And also steroids can be added. If the saturation is less than 94%, many times we are seeing this paucity of beds. We are starting steroids at home for low saturations, and it comes up with the home therapy.
Dr. Kushwaha, yes.
So saturation 90 in home has to be seen in totality, not only the number. You have to see what the patient is, what is the patient's age, what is the morbidity that they have. You know, my mother was at home and she couldn't get a bed, and she had about 88 saturation, and I was sitting here watching her on video, and I said, you stay home, continue to take your medications, you will improve. And with that saturation 88, 90, 88, 90 easily, within 3, 4, 5 days, she has recovered her complete symptoms as well as her saturation. Now it has come up to 92, 93. It's very fine. I think most of the time we have to see the whole picture, not the saturation alone as a measure of this thing. You have to see the symptomatology also of the individual, the comorbidities, and so many things. And it's not really an urgent this thing. The moment the saturation touches 90, you have to rush to the hospital. I don't think that is going to be feasible. Neither we can provide that much of infrastructure or the hospital beds for all of us in this country.
Right, thank you, sir. The next, yes, ma'am, there is.
Yes, sir. In a previously referred case, should we take the help of imaging like HRCT thorax? Because at home the patient is desaturating is not a good sign. I think the help of imaging should be taken in such case, and depending on the morbidity, we have to proceed, not left like that at home. Because I am very sure that after 6-minute walk test, this patient will be desaturating more as compared to his 90% saturation. So this is a high alert sign, what I call as like.
Okay, so the message basically is that it's a sign that you need to be careful, and just because proning is bringing it up to above 90, don't just assume everything is okay. Keep a close watch on it. And if it seems to be going down regularly, then maybe you need additional intervention or contact your doctor if he needs to do imaging for it. The next question that we have here is on the tapering of steroids. So if we're giving steroids at home, do we need to taper them before we turn them off, or can we just stop abruptly? So what is the practice generally? Yeah, Neeraj.
Yeah, so normally 5 to 7 days is what we prescribe in home isolation depending on symptom of the patient. If patient is improving after 2-3 days, then we can taper down and stop in 5 to 7 days. But if patient is further deteriorating, we might have to actually step up the steroid dose. So depending on the patient, 5 to 7 days should be more than sufficient.
Okay.
This is Dr. Amrusha from Nagpur. I had earlier logged out for some technical reasons while we were talking about the steroids. Actually, I'm not sure if this was covered then, but I think it is really important for us to understand that as much as we are depending on the benefits of steroids, we majorly need to understand the problems that we may have because of unnecessary use of steroids. We are already seeing a pandemic of mucormycosis, and a lot of my colleagues with whom I'm in touch with, and we know that there are several GPs and other doctors who are giving steroids to patients with mild disease. just randomly giving steroids. They're even seeing patients coming with AVN even in the younger age groups. So I think it is extremely important that we understand that we don't misuse steroid and use it only for the indicated patients and only for the indicated period of time.
Thank you. So that actually addresses another question which I was about to take up next, that are there any side effects of steroids if taken on the very first day? So you made it very clear that just because steroids bring your fever down and bring the inflammation down, that doesn't mean that they come without harm. And you cannot be just giving steroids to anybody and everybody on day one. There is a specific indication dose that has to be followed.
Can I add in here, please?
Yeah, sure, please, Manish.
Yeah, regarding this question on for use of first day steroids, theoretically it should be given because it will prolong the viral replication. Practically in the recovery trial that we see, patients who were given steroids early on without the need for oxygen, they actually fared worse. So yes, we should not be, that should be very clear. And that's why if we look at the wording of the protocol, I think it has been worded appropriately. High grade fever, severe cough, beyond 7 days, and in consultation with the physician. So ma'am just talked about our concerns, which is concern for every one of us. And this is very rightly, I think. We need to really emphasize that this is done at all levels of care.
Yes, and I really believe that we should absolutely emphasize in whatever ways we can in our guidelines about the steroids, because here in Nagpur, the experience that we are having significant number of mucormycosis, and they're coming at a very late stage. One of the patients that was admitted with us who received just 5 days of steroids already has mucormycosis and is going to have a debridement today or tomorrow. So we really need to be careful about this.
Right, thank you. So there are some questions which are actually repetitions of previous questions, but I'm just picking up one or two of them because I think they're worth repeating. So there's somebody who says was diagnosed with COVID based on an RT-PCR, took some medications, repeated an RT-PCR for whatever reason, and now got a CT value of 16. So does he now start from 0, or what happens to him? So he's asymptomatic, took medications, but got an RT-PCR done again, and it came back positive with a CT value of 16. So how long does he continue to be isolated now? Knowing that this could be non-replicative virus, knowing that this is something which could happen, does the CT value help you in deciding how long the isolation should be? And I think your answer was very clear in the beginning that it doesn't make a difference. All right, we're going to move.
Whether that patient has some comorbidity can also help us in guiding, because those who are immunosuppressed may have prolonged viremia. That is a known aspect. So we have to take into account that also.
Right. So unless there is comorbidities or immunosuppressed state, it may not mean much. But of course, you will need to consult a physician before you say this is okay. Now that you've got a test and a value, you need to consult somebody to understand its interpretation. The next question, again, staying on the drugs, is role of oseltamivir. Is it being used and does it have any value? Universal shake of heads, I think, across the panel.
If I can add here.
Please.
So what we have is a routine surveillance among the samples being collected, a proportion of it being tested for influenza viruses. So as of now, we don't see any spike, in fact, any case of influenza among in the last few months. So it is a very important question. We have to be prudent, and we must be having a mechanism of surveillance. So let's say 5 or 10% of our samples coming for COVID testing, we also get tested for influenza, those group of patients. So if we start picking up influenza, if we are in that period of the year, yes, in different parts of the country. So if we are in that part of a period where the influenza is coming up, maybe oseltamivir may also come into picture.
All right. So then the next drug that a question has been raised about is montelukast. When, how much, and to whom? Again, all home isolation.
Montelukast we have not given as a symptomatic treatment. So it's the anti-allergic drugs like cetirizine and fexofenadine that may actually give symptomatic benefit. Montelukast's primary role is in preventive aspect. So if somebody is asthmatic or something of that sort, then they can use prior to the seasonal variation that happens in such patients. But in COVID-19, I don't think it has any role, and we are not prescribing it routinely. Though the combination of levocetirizine and fexofenadine most of the time have montelukast, which I feel is not appropriate.
I see a lot of questions here which are now, I have this, we have this. So it means that the link has possibly now gone out to patients more than physicians alone. We had more than 950 people attending just the Zoom platform. So I have a feeling that a lot of these questions are now being raised by patients directly. And we would like to clarify that this particular webinar is primarily training of physicians. It's a discussion among doctors who are caring for patients, and it's a panel for them to discuss their management strategies. It is not a platform where we will be answering patient questions directly. And therefore, we will be skipping a large number of questions that are on this panel, which are all relating to personal problems. Let me just run down this to see if there's anything else that we have to take right now. Again, I got positive, my father is positive, I have. How do you distinguish a panic attack from COVID-induced breathlessness? That's another question here. COVID-induced panic versus COVID-induced breathlessness. Anybody here?
So one can check the saturation and what is the pulse rate that can help in guiding. If saturation is fine, patient has tachycardia, then possibility of panic reaction is more. And if saturation is less, along with tachycardia, then maybe the patient is actually getting breathless and desaturating.
Okay.
If you have features of hyperventilation, in addition to dyspnea, you may have other symptoms as well, such as perioral tingling. Because if you are hyperventilating and washing out your carbon dioxide, so there may be dizziness, pre-syncope, you may have perioral tingling. So there's a score as well, which is used in hyperventilation syndrome for all the physicians who are initiated into management of these. And the saturation is as already been mentioned.
Right, thank you. So this is an interesting question. I think it's relevant as well. In home isolation, if more than one person in the family are positive but became positive at different time points with overlapping times, one was positive 5 days earlier or 3 days earlier and the other one's been tested 3 days later, can they stay together or do they also need to be separated? And this is pretty common. You have multiple people in the family testing positive at various points of time.
They can stay together, I think.
Yeah, even in wards, we keep patients with different days of illness together. So I don't think that should be a problem.
Right. So the general advice is yes, if you are positive, another person is positive, there's no reason to keep distances. It's assumed that it's not an issue of somebody has A strain, another one has B strain, and the two of you need to be separate. So that's not the objective here. All right, I'm going to move forward and see if I can. Again, we're not going to be addressing specific patient-related queries. That is not the objective of this panel. Okay. I don't know whether this panel has any experience on this. Aspidosperma Q, something called Aspidosperma Q, a medication. I didn't take up questions on coronal. I was pretty convinced nobody on the panel wanted to answer those, but this is something I'm not aware of. All right, it seems nobody on the panel wants to address this question, so we'll move on. It's not something that they are familiar with. I'm still running down. Many of these are, can steroids be continued beyond 7 days in home isolation? Or should they stop at day 7 after 7 days in home isolation? I think Manish, no, Neeraj addressed this a little earlier, saying that at times you need to continue for much longer. And of course, if you're hospitalized, it would continue for even longer. So there is no fixed deadline as to when steroids. Am I right, Neeraj?
Yes, sir. So only if the symptom is progressing, then only the steroid might require to be extended. And in that case, mostly these patients will require hospitalization. So depending on the situation of the patient, one can take a call. It's not a sacrosanct after 5 days you have to stop. You have to take a call based on the symptoms of the patient.
Right. Again, a lot of individual questions. Okay, one more question which somebody might want to take note of: colchicine. Any experience? Anybody would like to comment on that?
Colchicine, one trial long back did show that colchicine is basically an anti-inflammatory agent and used to
You can type that.
So basically, if a patient has on high dose steroids and still continues to be having high inflammatory markers and deteriorating, and or he's a diabetic and his blood sugar is getting highly uncontrolled, in this situation, when the blood sugar is not being controlled and we cannot and steroids are not working properly, I think doses of 0.5 milligrams of colchicine twice a day may have some effect, anti-inflammatory action, and may help in cytokine storm. Of course, there are a lot of other negative studies as well. So there is no, but that colchicine actually saved lives just like steroids did. So there is some role, I think, of colchicine in selected patients where the steroids have been either have a lot of side effects or have some or they are not working so well.
Okay, we are having a patchy connection.
If I can add, we are talking. We are focusing today on home-based.
Anybody? This is my personal experience. Not much of experience. If anybody has more experience, they can.
There was this trial called Corona from Canada, which actually was never published, and based on that, there was hype that this will actually work. And since we are talking about the home isolation and treatment, I don't think it has any role there.
Yeah.
And colchicine has its own problem. It is not a very safe drug. You can say that it can be given to all. Its mechanism of action is very different from what we usually utilize for control of inflammation in such patients. Colchicine has basically it can depress bone marrow. It has GI side effects, which is again a problem in COVID-19 patients as such. So using colchicine in most of patients, I don't think it's a very good drug to be used in our patients of COVID-19. And in fact, it can cause more harm than good to these patients. None of the trials have actually shown any advantage. In fact, most of them have shown rather problematic side effects of this particular drug. So I don't think it should be recommended in any of the patients.
All right. So one last question that I have on the chat box, actually, methylpred versus Dexa. Any particular choice in home isolation therapy?
So currently, out of two, whatever you can get, you can prescribe because there is shortage of this drug. And considering the half-life of dexamethasone is more and OD dosing can be easily done, so it can be used if available. Otherwise, methylpred is equally good. So there should not be a choice between the two. It should more be based on the availability of the drug. Sometimes the patient are saying, okay, they are getting 0.5 milligram tablet of Dexona. So they have to take multiple tablets from that point of view. So depending on what you are able to get, one can take in equivalent doses. Both should work fine.
Thank you, Neeraj, and thank you, panelists. I think we've covered most of what we needed to discuss in this panel today for home management and drug therapy. If anybody on the panel wants to add something, they are free to do so. Otherwise, we will meet again. Yes, ma'am. You're still mute, ma'am. We can't hear you.
Sir, I want to know the step up in the treatment for inhaled budesonide to the remdesivir in a case with persistent fever in the mild cases now. What is our threshold? Because most of the patients, they come to us after 4 to 5 days after taking ivermectin and doxycycline. And now the choice is between inhaled budesonide and was going to the remdesivir. So what is the time lag? After how many days we have to try one drug and then second drug and the third drug? Because remdesivir to be used, now we have a 10 to 14 days timeline is there. So how to go for that?
So ma'am, let me just clarify a little bit here. Remdesivir has a whole webinar to itself later in this week. So we'll avoid the Remdesivir questions today and we'll take it up when we do the Remdesivir. That's on Friday as per the current schedule. Dr. Joshi. You're mute, Dr. Joshi, we can't hear you.
Okay, just a small question about query about controversy about its use of steroids. We all know steroids should not be used on day one. It is being rampantly used, but there is a situation even in home isolation when we do inflammatory markers, they are markedly elevated. Patient is not desaturating. He has a CRP of say about 48 or 50 and LDH and ferritin levels are high. He has fever in the first week itself. Is there any role of steroids in this circumstances where the patient has high inflammatory markers and probably after 4 or 5 days of fever, not only inhaled steroids, we know that has been recommended, but what about systemic steroids in a patient?
Again, history of that patient.
Steroids in patient who is otherwise not.
So,
yes.
So we are talking about first week of illness, day 5, 6, 7. So as Neeraj,
yes.
So what we are, I think what the thought process was to use steroids after the viral replication, that is day 8 and all. Prior to that, that's why this naproxen has been added, or any other NSAID for that matter, to have an immunosuppressive effect, but not not as strong.
Okay.
Probably that was the thought process. So currently the guidelines that I think we are following is use of NSAIDs when there's high grade fever, day 5, 6 of illness. I think if I got the question right.
Thank you, Manish. Anybody else would like to have any closing remarks before we close for today? Yes, Nigrams.
Sir, can we consider adding famotidine for non-hospitalized mild COVID-19 cases? Like, is there any evidence on famotidine? As it has been used in some of the states, even put in the treatment protocol also.
Well, again, the evidence. Yeah. So there was a systematic review, a small one, few hundred patients, and really for definitive answers, a much larger trial or data is required. So in last 1 year, nothing of that sort has come. And in major guidelines that we see across the world, I don't think famotidine is being promoted anywhere. I do see in some places it is being used. As of now, it is not in any of the major guidelines per se, as far as we know.
Thanks, Manish. So I think we had a very fruitful discussion again today. And with these two webinars, we close the discussion on home isolation. The next meeting that we have tomorrow will be discussing more about convalescent plasma. And I request you all to join in again tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll be doing this at 3 p.m. instead of 4 p.m. today. And we'll have the webinar again at 3 p.m. tomorrow. So thank you everyone for joining in, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you, Neeraj, and thank you, Manish, particularly for addressing a lot of these questions. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir.